The tires of Mark's luxury sedan crunched softly on the gravel driveway as he returned home, earlier than expected. His watch read 10:05 p.m. His keen eyes caught the glint of parked cars, unfamiliar, sleek, polished, and numerous. He frowned. The golden glow spilling through the gaps in the curtains whispered of warmth, laughter, and something else, an invasion of comfort he couldn't place. A tremor of unease slithered down his spine. As he stepped out of the car, the cool night air stung his face, sharpening his senses. His feet moved silently across the stone path, leading to the wide oak door of his house, once a fortress of trust and devotion. Now, it stood as a barrier hiding whispers of betrayal. The voices drifted through the crack beneath the door, a mixture of playful laughter and lilting tones. Mark hesitated, heart thumping with a mix of dread and anger that coiled into cold resolve. The scene in his mind clashed violently with reality. Evelyn, his wife, spirited and bright-eyed, now surrounded by strangers in the sanctity of their home. Without warning, Mark pushed the door open. The noise halted, replaced by a thick silence as every gaze turned towards the shadowed figure at the threshold. The air grew dense as Mark stepped into the living room, each second stretching into an eternity. He scanned the room with eyes as sharp as cut glass, taking in the scene that confirmed his darkest suspicions. Evelyn stood at the center, her auburn hair tousled and cheeks flushed, wineglass suspended midair. Around her lounged 5 strangers, men and women, alike each embodying the careless decadence she now craved. The room itself seemed to mock him, bathed in warm, dim light that highlighted the casual opulence of their life. Crystal glasses glittered on the mahogany table, half-empty bottles of fine wine scattered haphazardly. The scent of perfume and expensive cologne mingled with the soft buzz of alcohol. Mark's shadow stretched into the room, his figure imposing, wrapped in the silent rage that held him prisoner. For a moment, nobody moved. The unfamiliar guests exchanged wary glances, their amusement curdling into unease. Evelyn's smile faltered, eyes widening as recognition met the cold steel of his gaze. "Mark," she whispered, a waver in her voice that spoke volumes. The silence deepened. His name, spoken with that fractured syllable, was more confession than greeting. He took a measured step forward. "Quite the gathering," he said, his voice level but carrying a sharp edge. It wasn't a question, and it cut through the air like a razor. One of the younger men, who had been lounging with an arrogant ease, shifted uncomfortably. He met Mark's eyes, only to look away quickly, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her glass, as if it could anchor her. "Mark, it's not what it looks like," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, spare me," Mark interrupted, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. The mirthless sound echoed, ringing out in the room like a warning bell. He advanced another step, now only a few feet away. "If you're going to spin tales, at least make them interesting." No one dared to move. The seconds stretched thin, laden with Mark's scrutiny as he catalogued each face, each guilty shift of eyes. He felt the burn of humiliation, like acid crawling up his throat, mingling with the ice in his veins. Evelyn's eyes glistened, but not with tears of remorse. She opened her mouth, then closed it, searching for words that never came. The weight of his stare forced her shoulders to hunch, as if she could shrink from his judgment. Finally, Mark's expression settled into something almost serene, the calm before a storm. "I'll make this brief," he said, voice dropping to a near whisper. The guests leaned in, not wanting to miss a word. "You've shown me everything I needed to see, Evelyn. Thank you for that." Her eyes pleaded silently, but he was beyond persuasion. He cast a final glance over the room, taking in the shallow attempts at decadence that now felt hollow and cheap. Mark turned on his heel, the thud of his shoes against the marble floor the only sound as he walked out. The door closed behind him with a shuddering finality, leaving a room of stunned silence and the echoes of a trust shattered beyond repair. The night was a cold embrace as Mark stood outside, the sharp wind biting at his face. The distant sounds of crickets and the rustle of leaves felt dissonant against the storm within him. He reached for his car door, pausing as his hand trembled not from fear, but the rawness of betrayal pulsing through him. His jaw clenched so tightly it hurt, but it grounded him, kept him from letting his rage erupt unchecked. Inside, muffled voices rose and fell, attempts at forced laughter breaking the silence. He knew they were trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to shake off the specter he'd left behind. But Mark no longer cared. Evelyn's deceit had carved a wound deep and jagged, yet he felt a twisted relief in finally knowing the truth. Sliding into the driver's seat, Mark gripped the steering wheel, until his knuckles turned white. The chill leather beneath his palms was a stark contrast to the heat searing through his chest. He took a long, shuddering breath and then another. The world outside the car was painted in shadows, matching the turmoil behind his eyes. He couldn't go back inside. The Mark who had shared that home, who had once laughed with Evelyn under its vaulted ceilings, was now a ghost. He started the engine, the low rumble and anchor, pulling him out of the trance. He needed distance, space to think without the taint of that room's reality suffocating him. The city lights blurred as he drove through familiar streets. Every landmark, every turn, was a reminder of the life they had built, and the foundation now crumbling beneath him. He passed the small cafe where they'd had their first date, the park where they'd picnicked in the summer. Each memory twisted in his chest like a knife. Stopping at a red light, Mark's mind wandered back to Evelyn's face, the flash of guilt, the tightening of her lips, the moment she realized that she couldn't lie her way out. It should have brought him satisfaction, seeing her caught and cornered, but all he felt was the ache of betrayal settling like a weight on his chest. He needed to act, not just reel in silent agony. His thoughts turned cold and precise. Tomorrow the divorce would be set in motion. This wasn't just about reclaiming his dignity, it was about severing himself from the rot of deceit she'd infected their life with. The mere thought of it steadied him. The power to choose, to reclaim control, coursed through him like a shot of adrenaline. The light turned green, and Mark pressed the gas pedal, determination carving new paths through the confusion. He wouldn't be the broken man Evelyn might expect. No, he'd walk away from this shattered, yes, but stronger, with the pieces of himself reforged, colder and unyielding. A home was no longer a place of return, but a battle to be left behind. Mark's jaw set as he drove into the darkness, a hint of cold, vengeful resolve finally sparking behind his eyes. The next morning broke harsh and grey, fitting the mood Mark woke up to. He had barely slept, caught between vivid memories and the gnawing ache of reality. He sat up on the stiff hotel bed, staring at the reflection in the cracked mirror. The man looking back at him was tired, eyes sunken and bloodshot, but beneath the exhaustion there was an ember of determination that refused to die out. Mark dressed in silence, the ritual mechanical and detached. He tugged at the cuffs of his suit jacket, feeling the weight of the day pressing on him. Today would not just be a day of decisions, it would be the first day of reclaiming his life. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and for a moment he considered ignoring it. But he reached over and saw the name, Evelyn. The screen glowed accusingly, but he didn't flinch. He let it ring until it fell silent, a small victory in a battle of many to come. As he left the hotel and stepped into the crisp morning air, the city unfolded before him in shades of slate and silver. The steady hum of traffic and distant chatter of pedestrians were a grounding force, reminding him that the world was indifferent, unaltered by his private turmoil. This was a comfort. In a way it meant he could slip into the rhythm of life, unobserved and focused. Mark's first stop was the law office downtown. The building stood tall and foreboding, its glass facade reflecting his composed but storm-ridden exterior. Inside, a receptionist greeted him with a polite smile that faded slightly as he approached, the weight of his presence unmistakable. "Good morning. I'm here to see Mr. Reynolds," Mark said, his voice steady, betraying none of the emotion coiled inside. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds is expecting you," the receptionist replied, guiding him toward a corner office where the lawyer sat amidst stacks of files and mahogany furniture. Mr. Reynolds, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s, looked up as Mark entered. "Mark," he said, standing up and extending a hand, "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Mark nodded curtly, taking the offered seat across the polished desk. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Reynolds. I need to start divorce proceedings today. Immediate, decisive action." The lawyer's brows arched subtly, but he nodded, opening a pristine file marked with Mark's name. "I anticipated this. We'll ensure your interests are protected." They went over the details, the assets, the properties, and the strategy for limiting Evelyn's claims. Mark felt no guilt as they discussed cold, practical measures. It wasn't spite that drove him, but survival, a need to reclaim control of what he could. As the conversation deepened, the sting of betrayal became a secondary concern. Now it was about the steps forward, the restructuring of his life, no longer tethered to lies. Mark signed the initial paperwork, his pen strokes confident, each signature a declaration of independence. He pushed the documents back across the desk, and for the first time since the night before, a flicker of relief passed over him. "Consider it done," Mr. Reynolds said, sealing Mark's choice with professional assurance. Mark stood, feeling the weight on his shoulders ease slightly as he walked out. The battle had begun. and for the first time, he felt ready. As Mark left the lawyer's office, the gravity of what he had set into motion settled in. A part of him wanted to look back at what he was leaving behind, the memories, the echoes of laughter that used to fill his home, but the pull of betrayal was stronger. It shoved him forward, urging him to close the chapter and write a new one, no matter how painful. The street outside was alive with the mundane routines of others, a woman briskly walking her dog, a barista balancing a tray of takeaway coffees, a teenager texting with a furrowed brow. It was a snapshot of life that seemed so ordinary, so blissfully unaware of the war within him. Mark exhaled, a sharp, bitter breath that escaped like a warning whistle. He was part of this world again, no longer numbed by the safety of assumptions. His phone vibrated in his pocket, breaking the trance. He glanced at the screen, another message from Evelyn. "Mark, please, we need to talk. I can explain." He could almost hear the desperation in her voice, see the familiar way her hands would tremble when she was caught lying. This time there was no doubt, no hesitation. He deleted the message and blocked her number, the act feeling both heavy and liberating. The next stop was home. He needed to gather the last of his things, important documents, personal items he didn't want left in a house that no longer felt like his own. The thought of stepping back into that space, with its polished floors and memories lurking in every corner, made his jaw tighten. But it had to be done. Mark pulled into the driveway, the sight of Evelyn's white SUV still parked there, triggering a reflexive clench of his fists. His steps were firm as he pushed open the front door, not bothering to call out. The house was eerily quiet, the evidence of last night's betrayal still scattered across the living room. A stray wine glass sat on the table, lipstick smudged against its rim, a silent witness to Evelyn's choices. He heard movement upstairs. Evelyn appeared at the top of the staircase, her eyes wide and shadowed, her hair tied back in a loose knot that looked hastily done. She wore a robe, its belt knotted tightly, as if it could shield her from what was coming. Their eyes met, and in that moment Mark saw not just the woman he had married, but the stranger she had become. "Mark," she said, voice barely audible, a tremor betraying her fear. "Please, can we talk?" He took a slow breath, each word a measured drop of ice. "There's nothing left to say. I came to get what's mine." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but he noticed how they didn't spill over. It was as if even her grief was half-formed, like the lies she'd been telling. She descended a step, then another, hesitant. It was a mistake. A stupid, reckless mistake. "I can't lose you." The anger he'd carried like armor cracked, just for a second, letting something more profound seep in. "You already have," he said, his voice unyielding but quiet. "And what you've done, it's not a mistake. It's a choice you made over and over again." The finality in his tone seemed to reach her, and she clutched the banister as if it could keep her from collapsing. Mark moved past her without another word, walking toward the study where he kept his documents. The room smelled of old books and cedar, a space that had always brought him peace. Now it was just another ghost of what was lost. He opened the drawers, methodically gathering passports, legal papers, and a few framed photographs that once meant everything. His fingers lingered on one photo, a candid shot of them laughing at a summer barbecue, oblivious to the undercurrents that would one day rip them apart. He set it down, face down on the desk. When he returned to the hallway, Evelyn was still standing there, silent tears now streaming down her face. He felt a momentary pang, nostalgia, pity, maybe even love, but it was quickly swallowed by the cold resolve that had kept him upright since last night. "Goodbye, Evelyn," he said, heading for the door. The echo of his steps was the only answer. The door closed behind him with a click that resonated like a final note. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn, but Mark felt no warmth. He walked to his car, the weight of grief still pressing on him, but lighter somehow without the burden of lies. As the engine roared to life, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the house that had once been a symbol of his success, his happiness. It was just a structure now, stripped of meaning. The road ahead was uncertain, full of jagged edges and unanswered questions, but it was his. For the first time in years, Mark drove forward, away from betrayal, and toward the possibility of a life on his terms.